Perfection was a scent, and to King Raegor Virelis it smelled like embalming fluid. It was the smell of the 1,000 women standing in his great hall, stiff, flawless, and utterly dead inside. For 3 centuries he had learned to read the language of it, the specific notes of rose oil and desperation that clung to noblewomen who had rehearsed their smiles in mirrors until their faces forgot how to show anything real. The cloying sweetness of ambition masked as devotion, the metallic tang of carefully suppressed fear. They lined the hall in their crimson and emerald gowns, a sea of silk and strategic cleavage, and every single one of them reeked of the same thing, the desire to possess a king who could not be possessed. He had stopped feeling anything about it decades ago. Tonight, the scent was different. It was hers, a scent he almost didn't recognize because it was the first honest thing he'd smelled in a century. Raegor stood at the head of the obsidian dais, his silver hair falling past his shoulders, his eyes the colour of old blood in certain light, gold in others, but always cold. The grand selection, a tradition as ancient as his bloodline. Caelis Maxima, his adviser, stood to his right, her angular face carved into patient expectation. She had orchestrated this spectacle, arranged the 1,000 women by height and birth, ensured each was a suitable vessel for the Virelis dynasty. "You must choose, my king," Caelis had said that morning, her voice like silk over iron. "The council grows restless. You need an heir." What he needed, Raegor thought as his gaze swept over the rows of identical, eager faces, was to feel something other than this crushing, suffocating boredom. The hall was a masterpiece of architectural cruelty, vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, columns of black marble veined with silver, chandeliers burning with cold, eternal flame. The light fell in harsh angles, illuminating the women in the centre while leaving the edges in deep shadow. It was designed to showcase power, to remind everyone who entered that they stood in the domain of a predator. And predators, Raegor had learned, grew bored when the prey stopped running. The first woman stepped forward, a statuesque beauty with hair like spun copper. She smelled like vanilla and calculation. "Lady Seraphine of House Moreau, Your Majesty," Caelis announced. "Descended from the northern blood barons?" Raegor raised a hand, and Caelis fell silent. He could smell everything he needed to know, rehearsed attraction, hollow hunger for status. She was beautiful, perfect, completely, entirely empty. "Next," he said, then the next, and the next, lavender and lies, jasmine and jealousy. Then he smelled it. Grief, not performative grief, but raw, bone-deep sorrow, the kind that carved hollows in a person's chest. The scent of someone who had lost something irreplaceable and was still bleeding from the wound. The first real thing he'd smelled in 50 years. His head turned, predator's instincts locking on to the source. The scent came from the shadows, where servants stood in plain black and white uniforms, invisible as furniture. There, a young woman, her dark skin a stark contrast to the white apron, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood with eyes downcast, hands clasped, her entire posture screaming a desperate desire to disappear. She was trembling, not with fear of him, though there was that too, but with the effort of holding herself together. Raegor descended the dais. Caelis's voice cut through the silence. "Your Majesty, the selection is not yet—" He ignored her. The sea of gowns parted before him. He walked past 1,000 beauties and didn't spare them a glance, because all he could smell was her. He stopped directly in front of her. The hall went silent. "Look at me." It wasn't a request. Slowly she raised her head. Her eyes met his, dark, liquid, filled with fear, grief, and beneath it all, a flicker of defiance. She looked at him like he was a monster. She wasn't wrong. "What is your name?" "Bria, your Majesty." Bria. The name settled into his mind like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. Raegor withdrew the signet ring that had rested on his hand for 300 years, the ring that symbolized his choice, his claim, his future queen. He held it out to Bria. Her tray clattered to the floor. "This one," Raegor said. And the court exploded into chaos. They bathed her like she was a corpse being prepared for burial. Bria stood in the centre of a marble bathing chamber, her arms wrapped around herself as 3 handmaids, vampires all of them, with skin like porcelain and eyes that never blinked, scrubbed at her skin with brushes that felt like punishment. The water was scalding, scented with oils she couldn't name, and they worked in silence, their movements efficient and impersonal. "Lift your arms," one commanded, and Bria obeyed, because what choice did she have? They dressed her in silk the colour of midnight, a gown that clung to her body in ways that made her feel exposed, despite being covered from neck to ankle. They braided her hair with silver thread, painted her lips with something that tasted like copper and roses, and when they finally stepped back to admire their work, Bria didn't recognise the woman staring back from the mirror. She looked like a doll, a pretty fragile thing meant to be displayed. She wanted to scream. Instead, she was led through corridors that twisted like a labyrinth, past tapestries depicting battles she didn't understand and portraits of kings who all had Raegor's cold, unforgiving eyes. The handmaids deposited her in a chamber so vast it could have swallowed her entire village, then left without a word. The door closed with a sound like a tomb, sealing shut. Bria stood in the centre of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bed was an obscene thing, draped in black, velvet and furs, large enough to sleep 10 people. The walls were lined with books, the floor covered in rugs, so thick her feet sank into them. Everything smelled like him, cold stone and something darker, something that made her pulse quicken with fear she refused to name. She heard voices outside the door, raised, angry. "This is madness, your Majesty," Caelis Maxima's voice, sharp as a blade. "The court is already in uproar. Lady Seraphine's father is demanding an audience. House Moreau is threatening to withdraw their support. Let them." Raegor's voice was quieter, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "She is human, a servant. You have made a mockery of the selection, of tradition. I have made a choice that will lead to rebellion. The council will not accept a human queen. They will see this as weakness, then they are welcome to challenge me." The silence that followed was suffocating. When Caelis spoke again, her voice was colder. "You do not even know her." "No," Raegor said, and Bria could hear something in his tone she couldn't decipher. "But I intend to." Footsteps, retreating. Bria's hands were shaking. She looked around the chamber, this gilded cage, and felt the walls closing in. She couldn't stay here, couldn't stand still, couldn't think about what he intended or what the court would do to her, or the fact that she was wearing a dead woman's silk while her brother's grave grew cold in the ground. So she did the only thing that made sense. She found a cloth in the bathing chamber, rolled up the sleeves of the ridiculous gown, and started to clean. She scrubbed the already spotless floors, dusted shelves that held no dust, organised books that were already perfectly aligned. Her hands moved on instinct, finding rhythm in the familiar motions, and for the first time since the selection, she could breathe. That was how Raegor found her an hour later. He stood in the doorway, still as a statue, and watched as Bria, his chosen queen, dressed in a gown worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime, polished the legs of a chair on her hands and knees. "What," he said slowly, "are you doing?" Bria froze. She didn't look up. "Cleaning, Your Majesty." The confusion in his silence was almost palpable. Raegor had learned patience the way mortals learn to breathe, through necessity, through centuries of watching empires rise and crumble into dust. But watching Bria was testing the limits of even his considerable restraint. She had been in his chambers for 3 days, and she had not spoken a word beyond what was absolutely necessary. "Yes, Your Majesty. No, Your Majesty. As you wish, Your Majesty." Each response delivered in a voice so flat it could have been carved from stone. She cleaned, constantly, compulsively, as if she could scrub away whatever invisible stain she believed marked her, and she never, ever looked at him. He found himself drawn to her in ways he didn't understand. He would stand in the doorway and watch as she folded linens that didn't need folding, as she rearranged flowers that were already perfectly arranged. He watched the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to make herself disappear. He had chosen her because she was real, because her grief had cut through his apathy like a blade, through silk. But he was beginning to understand that he had claimed a woman who didn't want to be claimed. On the 4th night, he heard it, crying, soft, muffled, the kind of crying someone did when they were trying desperately not to be heard. It was coming from the balcony, a small stone terrace that overlooked the perpetual twilight of his kingdom. Raegor moved silently, a predator's instinct, and found her there. Bria sat on the cold stone floor, her knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Her shoulders shook with the force of sobs she was trying to swallow, and the sound, raw, broken, utterly human, struck something in his chest he had thought long dead. He should leave, give her privacy, let her grieve in peace. Instead, he stepped onto the balcony. "Who broke you?" The words came out harsher than he intended, not a question but a demand. Bria's head snapped up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. For a moment she looked like a cornered animal. Then something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like anger. "You did," she said, her voice hoarse. "Your kind did." Raegor went very still. Bria stood, unsteady on her feet, and for the first time since he'd chosen her, she looked directly at him, really looked at him, and there was no fear in her eyes now, only fury. "My brother," she said, each word a shard of glass. "He was 12 years old, 12. He got sick, a fever, nothing that couldn't be treated. But the healer wouldn't come, not to the human quarter, not for a servant's child. We begged, we offered everything we had. But vampires don't waste their time on human lives." Her voice broke, but she didn't look away. "He died in my arms, burning up with fever, calling for our mother who'd been dead for years, and I couldn't... She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if she could physically hold back the grief threatening to consume her. Raegor felt something crack inside him. Not his heart, that had stopped beating centuries ago, but something deeper, something he'd thought immortality had stripped away. "I hate you," Bria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I hate everything you are, everything you represent. You took him from me, and now you think you can just, dress me up and make me forget? Make me smile and play queen while children die, because their lives don't matter to monsters like you?" The word hung in the air between them. Monsters. She wasn't wrong. "What was his name?" Raegor asked quietly. Bria blinked, thrown by the question. What? Your brother. What was his name? Elian, she said, her voice barely a whisper. His name was Elian. Raegor nodded slowly, committing the name to memory, a small mortal life that had ended because of the callousness of his kind. I cannot bring him back, he said, but I can make sure it never happens again. Bria stared at him, searching his face for deception, for cruelty, for whatever game she thought he was playing. Why? She finally asked. Why do you even care? Raegor met her gaze, and for the first time in 50 years he told the truth. Because you made me feel something. The banquet hall was a gallery of predators dressed in silk and jewels, and Bria was the only prey in sight. She stood at the entrance in a gown of deep sapphire that Caelis had selected. Befitting your new station, the adviser had said with barely concealed contempt, and every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her like wolves scenting blood. Raegor had insisted she attend. You are to be queen, he'd said that morning. The court must see you. What the court saw, Bria thought, as she forced herself to walk forward, was a human pretending to be something she wasn't. The hall was obscene in its opulence, tables laden with dishes that smelled of spices and something metallic she didn't want to name, crystal goblets filled with wine so dark it looked like blood, candelabras dripping with pearls and diamonds. The noblewomen from the selection sat in clusters, their gowns a riot of crimson and emerald and gold, their beauty so perfect it looked carved rather than born, and they were all staring at her with expressions that promised violence. Raegor sat at the head of the long table, his silver hair catching the light, his face unreadable. Caelis stood behind him, whispering something Bria couldn't hear. He nodded once, then his eyes found hers across the room. For a moment something passed between them. A warning? A promise? Then Lady Seraphine stood, her copper hair gleaming, her smile sharp as a blade. "How lovely," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "The king's pet has decided to join us." Laughter rippled through the room like poison in water. Bria's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept walking, one foot in front of the other. She could survive this. She'd survived worse. A chair was pulled out for her, not near Raegor, but at the far end of the table, surrounded by the very women who despised her most. Bria sat, her spine rigid, and tried to disappear into herself the way she'd learned as a servant. The meal began. It started small. A noblewoman to her left, Lady Isolde, if Bria remembered correctly, reached for the wine carafe at the exact moment Bria did, jostling her arm just enough that dark liquid splashed across the front of Bria's gown. "Oh," Isolde said, her eyes wide with false concern, "how clumsy of you." More laughter. Bria said nothing. She dabbed at the stain with a napkin, her face burning. Then came the whispers, loud enough for her to hear, soft enough to have deniability. "I heard she was scrubbing floors when he found her. Can you imagine? A human queen. The bloodline will be ruined. She probably used some kind of witchcraft. There's no other explanation." Bria's appetite, already non-existent, vanished entirely. She pushed food around her plate and prayed for the meal to end. It got worse when she stood to excuse herself, desperate for air, for escape. Lady Seraphine's foot shot out beneath the table. Bria went down hard, her knees slamming against the marble floor. Her palms caught her fall, and she felt something sting. Blood, bright and red against the white stone. The hall erupted in barely concealed amusement. "Careful, dear," Seraphine said sweetly. "These floors can be so slippery, though I suppose you're used to being on your knees." Something inside Bria broke, not her spirit, that had shattered the night Elian died, but the last fragile thread of composure holding her together. tears pricked at her eyes, hot and humiliating, and she hated herself for them. Then a shadow fell across her. Raegor stood over her, his hand extended. Not to pull her up, not yet, but offered, waiting for her to choose to take it. The hall went silent. Bria looked up at him, at the cold fury in his golden eyes, and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, and he lifted her to her feet with a gentleness that contradicted everything she'd believed about him. He turned to face the court, still holding her hand. "Lady Seraphine," he said, his voice quiet and absolutely lethal, "you will apologize." Seraphine's smile faltered. "Your Majesty, I merely— On your knees!" The words cut through the hall like an executioner's blade. Seraphine's face went pale. Your Majesty, surely you cannot— Now." The command left no room for argument. Slowly, humiliatingly, Lady Seraphine of House Moreau sank to her knees on the same marble floor where Bria had fallen. Raegor's gaze swept across the assembled nobles, each one of them suddenly very interested in their wine goblets. "Let me be clear," he said. "Bria is under my protection. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Any harm that comes to her will be answered in blood. Are we understood?" Silence. Then murmured assent. Raegor looked down at Seraphine, still kneeling. "You may leave. Don't return to court until you remember how to show respect." He didn't wait to see her go. Instead, he tucked Bria's hand into the crook of his arm and led her out of the hall, leaving a room full of vipers with their fangs still bared but suddenly, finally afraid to strike. Caelis Maxima had served the Virelis line for 2 centuries, and in all that time she had never seen King Raegor look at anyone the way he looked at the human girl. It was in the small things. The way his gaze followed Bria when she moved through a room. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her, losing the edge of command that had defined him for 300 years. The way he had humiliated Lady Seraphine, one of the most powerful noblewomen in the kingdom, without hesitation, without regret. For a human, a servant. Caelis stood in her private study, fingers steepled beneath her chin, and considered the problem with the cold precision that had made her invaluable to 3 generations of vampire kings. Raegor was falling for her, perhaps had already fallen, and that made Bria the single greatest threat to the stability of the realm. The council was already fracturing. House Moreau had withdrawn their representatives. The eastern provinces were rumbling about autonomy. The whispers of rebellion that had started as jokes were beginning to sound like plans, all because their king had chosen his heart over his duty, or whatever passed for a heart in a creature as old as Raegor. Caelis had tried reason. She had tried warnings. She had tried appealing to his sense of legacy, of responsibility, of the blood oaths that bound the noble houses to the throne. None of it had worked, which meant more drastic measures were required. She opened a drawer in her desk and withdrew a sealed letter, correspondence she had intercepted 3 weeks ago from the rival kingdom of Ashenvale. An offer of alliance, signed by their ambassador, written in the flowery diplomatic language that meant nothing and everything. It would be simple enough to forge a response, to make it appear as though someone within Raegor's own court had been feeding information to their enemies, to plant evidence in the right places, whisper in the right ears, and watch as suspicion bloomed into certainty. And who better to blame than the human girl who had appeared from nowhere and captivated their king? Caelis began to write, copying Bria's handwriting from the service logs she'd kept as a maid. The girl had a neat, careful script, the kind taught in village schools, distinctive enough to be recognizable. "The king trusts me more each day, his defences weaken. When the time comes, the eastern gate will be left unguarded as discussed. It was crude, obvious even, but it didn't need to be sophisticated. It only needed to plant doubt. She made 3 copies, each slightly different, each dated over the past 2 months. Then she tucked them into her robes and made her way through the palace's hidden passages, the ones only the king's closest advisers knew existed. First, she visited the royal archives, where she slipped one letter between the pages of a treaty ledger that Bria had been seen reading a week ago. Raegor had been teaching her about the kingdom's history, another sign of his dangerous attachment. Second, she went to the servants' quarters and placed another letter in the false bottom of a trunk that had belonged to Bria before she'd been moved to the royal chambers. It would be found eventually. These things always were. The third letter she kept for herself. Insurance. Then came the final touch. Caelis made her way to the garden, a wild, overgrown place where poisonous flowers bloomed in the perpetual twilight. She found what she was looking for quickly. A black rose, its petals dark as a moonless night, its thorns sharp enough to draw blood. In the vampire court, a black rose meant only one thing: death. She carried it back to the palace wrapped in silk, careful not to touch the thorns. They were coated in a toxin that could kill a human in hours, though it would merely sicken a vampire. She climbed the stairs to the royal chambers, listening carefully to ensure neither Raegor nor Bria were inside. The room was empty. Caelis moved quickly, placing the black rose on Bria's pillow, its stem positioned just so, its dark petals stark against the white silk. A clear message, a promise of violence. When Bria saw it, she would be terrified. She would run to Raegor, and he would demand answers, would tear the palace apart looking for whoever had threatened his precious human. And Caelis would be there, loyal advisor, concerned counsellor, to suggest that perhaps they should investigate whether Bria had made enemies, whether there was more to her story than she'd revealed, whether someone as inconsequential as a human maid could really have caught a king's attention without some kind of leverage. The seeds of doubt, once planted, would grow quickly. Caelis stood in the doorway, surveying her work. Everything was in place. Within days, perhaps hours, the carefully constructed fiction would begin to unravel the equally fictional romance between a king and a servant. The kingdom would be saved from the chaos of a human queen. And if Bria had to die in the process, well, humans died all the time. Their lives were brief, inconsequential things. Raegor would grieve, perhaps, but he would recover. He always did. Caelis left the chamber and locked the door behind her, her expression serene, her conscience clear. She was, after all, only protecting her king, even if it meant protecting him from himself. Bria found the black rose at dusk. She had returned to the royal chambers exhausted from another day of navigating the court's barely concealed hostility, wanting nothing more than to collapse into bed and let unconsciousness claim her. Instead, she found death waiting on her pillow. The scream caught in her throat came out as a strangled gasp. Her hands shook as she backed away from the bed, her mind racing. Someone had been in here. Someone had touched her things, had stood where she slept, had left a promise of violence in a language she was only beginning to understand. She was still standing there, frozen, when Raegor entered. He took one look at her face, then at the rose, and his expression went cold in a way that was somehow more terrifying than anger. "Who did this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Bria managed. I found it." Raegor crossed to the bed in 2 strides, picking up the rose by its stem. He studied it for a long moment. Then his jaw tightened. "Come with me," he said. "What? Where?" "Now." It wasn't a request, but there was something in his voice that wasn't command either, something that sounded almost like fear. He led her through corridors she'd never seen, down staircases that spiraled into darkness, through doors that opened at his touch without keys. They walked in silence, Raegor's hand hovering near the small of her back, not touching but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. Finally they emerged into a garden, but not like any garden Bria had ever seen. This one existed in a pocket of the castle that seemed untouched by the perpetual twilight outside. Here moonlight fell in silver streams through a glass ceiling, illuminating flowers that bloomed in impossible colours, blues that shifted to purple, whites that glowed with inner light, and yes, black roses like the one that had been left on her pillow. But these were different. These were alive, thriving, beautiful in their darkness. "This was my mother's garden," Raegor said quietly. "She designed it before she died. The only place in the palace where things grow without blood magic, without sacrifice, just soil and water and light." Bria looked at him, surprised. He never spoke of personal things, of family, of anything that suggested he had a history beyond the crown and the throne. "Why did you bring me here?" Raegor was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked her more than the black rose, more than the selection, more than anything that had happened since she'd entered his world. He knelt. Not a bow, not a courtesy, but a true kneel. One knee on the soft grass, his head level with hers, his golden eyes meeting hers without the weight of his crown, his power, his terrible immortality. "I'm sorry," he said. Bria's breath caught. "What?" "For your brother, for Elian." His voice was rough, unfamiliar with apology. "You were right. My kind did kill him. Not directly, perhaps, but through negligence, through the belief that human lives matter less than our convenience. I have ruled for 3 centuries, and I never questioned it, never saw it." He looked down at his hands, elegant, powerful hands that could crush stone or cradle something fragile. "Until you," he continued, "until I smelled your grief and realised I had spent so long being numb that I'd forgotten what it meant to feel. You hate me. You have every right to hate me. But I am trying." His voice cracked just slightly. "I am trying to be worthy of the chance you've given me by not running." Bria felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope, like the beginning of trust. "I'm still afraid of you," she whispered. "I know." "I still don't understand why you chose me." Raegor looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something raw in his expression, something that looked almost human. "Because you're the only thing in 300 years that's made me want to be better." The silence between them was different now, not hostile, not distant, but tentative, fragile. Slowly, carefully, Bria reached out and touched his face. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin, and Raegor went absolutely still, as if afraid that any movement would shatter the moment. She traced the line of his jaw, the sharp angle of his cheekbone, mapping the features of the monster who was trying to be a man. "I don't forgive you," she said softly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I know. But I'm—" She took a shaky breath. "I'm willing to see if you mean it." Raegor's hand came up slowly, covering hers where it rested against his face. His fingers were gentle, reverent, as if she were made of glass. "That's more than I deserve," he said. They stayed like that, a king on his knees and a servant learning to trust, while moonlight fell through glass and flowers bloomed in the darkness. And, for the first time since Elian died, Bria felt something other than grief. She felt the first tentative stirrings of healing, but neither of them saw the shadow in the doorway. Neither of them noticed Caelis Maxima watching with cold calculation, her plans already adapting to this new development. The game, after all, was far from over. Bria woke to the sound of splintering wood. For a disoriented moment she thought she was dreaming, that the crash of the door slamming open was part of some nightmare about her brother, about the night the fever took him. Then hands grabbed her, yanked her from the bed, and she realized with sharp, terrible clarity that this was real. "What? Let go of me!" She struggled against the guards, but they were vampire strong, their grips like iron manacles around her arms. "By order of the council," one of them said, his voice flat, mechanical. "You are under arrest for treason against the crown." "Treason? I didn't..." But they weren't listening. They dragged her into the corridor, her bare feet scraping against cold marble, her nightgown twisting around her legs. She looked desperately for Raegor, for anyone who might help, but the halls were empty except for Caelis Maxima. The advisor stood in the corridor like a sentinel, her face carved into an expression of grim satisfaction. In her hands she held a stack of papers. "I'm sorry it came to this," Caelis said, though her voice held no trace of regret. "But the evidence is irrefutable." "Evidence? What evidence?" Bria's voice was rising, panic clawing at her throat. "I haven't done anything." Caelis held up one of the papers. Even from a distance Bria could see it. Handwriting that looked disturbingly like hers. Words she'd never written. "Correspondence with the Kingdom of Ashenvale," Caelis said. 3 letters detailing the king's movements, his vulnerabilities, his trust in you, all in your hand, all signed with your name. That's not... I never wrote those. I've never even heard of Ashenvale. We also found this," Caelis continued, pulling out a small velvet pouch. She opened it, and gold coins spilled into her palm, foreign coins stamped with a crest Bria didn't recognize. "Payment for your services, hidden in your old trunk in the servants' quarters." "I don't have an old trunk. I came here with nothing." Bria was shouting now, thrashing against the guard's hold. "This is a lie. Someone planted..." "The king will be informed upon his return from the border patrol," Caelis said smoothly. "Until then, you will be held in the dungeons to await trial." "Where is he? Where's Raegor?" "King Raegor," Caelis corrected coldly, "received urgent word of an incursion at the eastern border. He left at nightfall. He won't return for at least 3 days." 3 days! The words hit Bria like a physical blow. Raegor was gone. He didn't know. He couldn't help. She was alone. "Take her," Caelis ordered. The guards dragged Bria down, 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 through passages that grew narrower and damper, past torches that flickered with sickly green flame, into the bowels of the palace where the air tasted like despair. The dungeon was everything nightmares were made of, walls that wept with moisture, cells carved from black stone, and the smell of old blood and older fear. They threw her into a cell and locked the door with a clang that echoed like a death knell. Bria scrambled to her feet, gripping the bars. "Please, I didn't do this. Someone is framing me." But the guards were already walking away, their footsteps fading into silence. She was alone in the dark. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in the suffocating blackness. Bria sat on the floor, her back against the wet stone wall, and tried not to think about what came next. Tried not to remember the stories she'd heard as a child about vampire justice, about executions that lasted days, about footsteps. Caelis appeared outside the cell, holding a torch that cast dancing shadows across her angular face. "I thought you should know," she said conversationally. The council has agreed to an expedited trial. Given the severity of your crimes and the instability your presence has caused, they've decided swift action is necessary." "I didn't do anything," Bria said, her voice hoarse. "That's irrelevant." Caelis tilted her head, studying Bria like a curiosity. "You were a threat the moment he chose you. Did you really think a human could be queen? That centuries of tradition, of bloodline purity, would bend for a servant girl?" "He'll come back," Bria said, trying to sound certain. "When Raegor finds out. When King Raegor returns, you'll already be dead." Caelis smiled, and it was a terrible thing. "Your execution is scheduled for dawn. The council has been very accommodating." The torchlight flickered, and Bria saw it then. The truth written in Caelis's cold eyes. The border patrol. The convenient timing. The evidence that appeared from nowhere. "You did this," Bria whispered. "All of it. You sent him away. You planted the letters. "I saved the kingdom," Caelis corrected. "From a king who forgot his duty. From a human who bewitched him into weakness." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I almost admire you. You made him feel something. That's more than anyone has managed in a century." "He'll kill you for this." Caelis's smile widened. "He'll thank me. Eventually." Then she was gone, and Bria was alone again in the dark. She pulled her knees to her chest and thought about Ellion, about how she'd promised him in those final fevered moments that she would survive, that she would live enough for both of them. She thought about Raegor kneeling in the moonlight garden, his hand covering hers, his voice rough with apology. She thought about dawn and what it would bring, and she wondered if anyone would tell him she'd been thinking of him at the end. Raegor smelled the lie before he reached the eastern border. There was no incursion, no enemy forces massing at the gate, only his own guards looking confused when he arrived, their captain stammering that no urgent message had been sent, that the border had been quiet for months. The truth hit him like a blade between the ribs. Caelis. He didn't bother with explanations or protocol. He simply turned and ran, his vampire speed transforming the world into a blur of twilight and shadow. 3 days' journey became 3 hours of relentless motion, his mind racing faster than his feet. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the place where his heart used to beat. He'd felt it since the moment he'd received the message, but he'd ignored the instinct, trusted his advisor, followed duty instead of Bria. He burst through the palace doors as dawn was breaking. True dawn, the kind that came only once a year in the Nocturne Kingdom, when the perpetual twilight gave way to pale, deadly sunlight for exactly 1 hour. The execution hour. The council chamber was empty. The throne room was empty. He followed the scent of fear and anticipation down into the dungeons, and what he found there made something ancient and terrible wake inside him. The execution chamber was a circular room carved from black stone, open to the sky through an iron grate. Pale light was already filtering through, growing stronger with each passing second. And in the centre of that room, chained to a post, was Bria. She was on her knees, her head bowed, her nightgown torn and dirty. Blood trickled from her wrists where the iron shackles had cut into her skin. Around her stood the council, 12 of the oldest, most powerful vampires in the kingdom, and Caelis Maxima, her face serene as she prepared to read the death sentence. "Stop!" The word came out as a growl, inhuman and absolute. Every head turned. Caelis's expression flickered just for a moment with something that might have been fear. "Your Majesty," she said smoothly, "you've returned early. We were just..." executing an innocent woman on fabricated charges. Raegor descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, and the temperature in the room dropped with each step. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't smell your lies all over this? The evidence," one of the council members began, "was planted." Raegor's eyes never left Caelis. "Wasn't it, advisor?" Caelis lifted her chin. "I did what was necessary to protect the kingdom from your catastrophic lapse in judgment. This human has made you weak, has turned you from your duty." "My duty," Raegor said, his voice dropping to something that was barely a whisper and somehow more terrifying than a shout, "is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. My duty is to rule with justice, not with the prejudice and cruelty that you have demonstrated here." He looked at Bria then. Her head had lifted, her eyes meeting his. Dark, exhausted, but still defiant. Still alive. Still his. "Release her," he commanded. No one moved. "Your Majesty, the council has voted—" Caelis tried. Raegor's hand shot out, grabbing Caelis by the throat and lifting her off her feet. Not hard enough to kill, not yet, but hard enough to make his point. "I am not asking." The chains around Bria's wrists shattered, not from any tool, but from the sheer force of Raegor's will, ancient magic responding to ancient fury. She collapsed forward, and he was there instantly, catching her, cradling her against his chest. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Then he turned to face the council, and they saw what he truly was. Not a bored king playing at politics, not a creature numbed by immortality, but the predator who had conquered this kingdom 3 centuries ago with blood and fire. "Caelis Maxima," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are hereby stripped of your position and banished from this kingdom. If you are found within our borders after sunset, your life is forfeit." He dropped her, and she crumpled to the ground. "As for the rest of you," his gaze swept across the council members, each one of them suddenly very aware of how fragile their existence was. "You will draft new laws regarding the treatment of humans in this kingdom, accessible healthcare, equal protection under the law, reparations for families who have suffered from our negligence. Your Majesty, that's not a suggestion." His arms tightened around Bria. "You have until sunset. Anyone who objects can join Caelis in exile." The sunlight was streaming through the grate now, deadly rays that would burn any vampire who touched them. But Raegor stood in the shadow, holding Bria, feeling her tears soak into his shirt. "You came back," she whispered. "Always," he said. "I will always come back for you." And in that moment, in a dungeon built for death, something that had been broken in both of them began, finally, tentatively, to heal. Not to the royal chambers with their empty opulence, not to the throne room where the court still whispered, but to the one place in the entire palace where things grew without sacrifice, where his mother had believed beauty could exist without cruelty. He laid Bria on a bench carved from white stone, cushioned with moss that glowed faintly silver in the moonlight. Her wrists were still bleeding where the iron had cut into her skin. Her face was pale as death, and she was trembling, not from cold, but from the aftermath of terror. "Let me see," he said softly, reaching for her hands. She let him. That was new. A week ago she would have pulled away. Raegor examined the wounds with a gentleness that contradicted everything he was. Predator, king, creature of violence. Then he did something he hadn't done in over a century. He bit his own wrist, let his blood well up dark and gleaming, and pressed it to her wounds. "It will heal you," he said when she tensed. "Vampire blood can't turn humans unless they die with it in their system, but it can heal. Bria watched as the cuts on her wrists closed, the pain fading to nothing. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd let me touch you." His honesty was raw, unguarded. "I wasn't sure you'd want anything from me, even healing." She looked at him then, really looked at him, at the silver hair falling into his eyes, at the exhaustion etched into features that should have been eternally ageless, at the way his hands trembled slightly as he held hers. "You decimated your own council for me," she said quietly. "I should have done it sooner." Caelis was right about one thing. Bria's voice was steady, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I have changed you, made you different than you were." "Yes," Raegor agreed. "You have." "Is that what you want? To be changed?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "For 300 years I have been the same, bored, numb, going through the motions of ruling without feeling anything. And then you stood in my hall, radiating grief so pure it cut through every defense I'd built, and for the first time in decades I felt something." "Pain," Bria said. "You felt my pain. I felt your humanity." Raegor looked at her with those golden eyes that had seen centuries rise and fall. "I felt what it meant to love something enough that losing it could break you. I'd forgotten that, forgotten what it meant to care that deeply." Bria's breath hitched. "I don't know if I can do this. Be what you need me to be. I'm not queen material, I'm just—" "You're Bria," he interrupted gently. "That's all I've ever needed you to be." Silence settled between them, broken only by the soft sound of water, trickling from a fountain, and the rustle of leaves in a breeze that somehow existed only in this garden. "I still miss him," Bria whispered. "My brother. I still wake up sometimes forgetting he's gone." "I know. And I still don't fully trust you. I want to, but I know that too." Raegor shifted closer, careful not to crowd her. "I'm not asking you to forget what my kind has done, what I have done through negligence and indifference. I'm asking for the chance to do better, to be better." Bria studied his face, searching for deception and finding only naked honesty. "The laws you demanded," she said, "the healthcare for humans, the equal protection. You meant all of that?" "Every word. I've already ordered the council to begin drafting the legislation. Any house that objects will lose their seat. They'll hate you for it." "They already do." A wry smile touched his lips. "At least now they'll have a good reason." Bria laughed, a small broken sound, but real, the first genuine laugh Raegor had heard from her. "What do we do now?" she asked. Raegor stood and offered her his hand, not to command, not to claim, but simply to invite. "Now," he said, "I give you a choice. You can leave. I will give you enough gold to live comfortably anywhere in the world, under any name you choose. You'll be free of this court, free of me, free to grieve and heal in peace. Or you stay. Not as my prisoner, not as a servant, but as my equal, my partner, my—" he paused, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. "My love." Bria looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. She thought about Elian, about the life she'd lost, about the girl she'd been before grief had carved her hollow. She thought about running, about safety, about the simple peace of obscurity. Then she thought about a king kneeling in moonlight, about laws being rewritten, about a monster learning gentleness, about a broken heart beginning, impossibly, to heal. She placed her hand in his. "I stay," she said, and 6 months later, when Bria sat beside Raegor on a throne carved from obsidian and silver, wearing a gown of midnight black embroidered with stars, the court no longer whispered about the maid who'd bewitched their king. They whispered about the queen who'd taught a monster how to feel, and in doing so had saved them all from becoming monsters themselves.